Right. So, welcome everyone to Kanban Coaching Exchange, and a great welcome to our speaker tonight, Tony Richards. I will pass it on to you, Tony, now.
Okay, thank you very much, Vlad. So just first and foremost, welcome everyone. My name is Tony Richards. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in a moment, but I just wanted to say how pleased I am to be speaking at this meetup. It's quite important to me because it was one of the first meetups I ever went to. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first. So when Helen asked me to come and speak, I, of course, said yes straight away. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share something up on the screen now. I'm going to be using Mentimeter today. So if you want to join along with me, there's the instructions on the screen now if you want to connect up. So you can either go to your browser and put in menti.com and enter the code 55121000. Or if you're on your phone, you can scan the QR code on your screen and that'll join you in. Everything I'm presenting today will be shared on this Zoom call, but it'll also be in your version of Menti. So you can follow along in there as well and ask questions, of course. So just to start things off, I just want to check who's on Menti. So could you help me out by putting down where you are today? So where you're coming from today. I see a few people coming in. So we've got London, Milton Keynes, Spain. Just going to see if I can move this out the way. There we go. So you can actually see the instructions for Menti. Jamaica, Ireland, home. Yeah, I'm hoping a lot of us are at home at the moment, which is a good thing. Okay, so if you want to join, as before, at the top of the screen, there'll be the instructions if you want to carry on jumping onto Menti. Otherwise, I'll share the screen as I go along. So just to kick things off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the title. So Agile at Altitude, the reason that I called it Agile at Altitude is twofold, really. One is about the environment that this organization I'm about to talk to you about conducted themselves in, so where they operated. And the other thing was about how the Kanban method was introduced across the organization at different levels. So it wasn't just at a team level, it was across the organization, hence the altitude in there. But just a little bit of background about myself first. I spend a lot of time, like many I'm sure on this call, working with teams. I'm also an accredited Kanban trainer. So this was one of the case studies I actually shared when I became a Kanban trainer. But when I'm not doing my Agile stuff, I'm also a professional coach and a coaching supervisor. So you're new to that's someone who works with other coaches, therapists, anyone in the helping profession, in fact. And then finally, I do a little bit of work with an organization called the Scrum Alliance as well. So I'm an advisor to them, mostly on their events and their gatherings program. But if you sort of recognize any of those things, or you're in the same kind of trade as me, hopefully the things I'm going to share today will resonate with you. But a bit of background first. So as Vlad explained, this isn't a software story. This is a story about an organization that did a kind of engineering, but a very different kind of engineering. It was physical engineering, and the engineering of very, very large things, absolutely huge, colossal things, and very complicated as well. And to make matters worse, a lot of the engineering they did ended up in the middle of the ocean. So they had the double whammy of this is big, heavy, complicated engineering in the physical sense, and also it's put into action in very, very hazardous situations, very dangerous situations as well. And when I arrived working with this organization, it was those days pre-COVID where everyone was in the office, and this picture is blurred out because it's a real picture. It's the genuine picture from the office, and this is real content. So this is one example of one of the teams I was working with. They, as you can see on the board, they were using colors. They were sort of, this was actually their backlog of work. They were starting to organize their backlog of requests in a very kind of deliberate way. And just on the right-hand side of the screen, just tipping off the edge of the picture, is their delivery board. Now, their delivery board had rows and swim lanes, all looked very good, except there were people's names in each of those lanes. So the teams were operating what I describe as in stacked to-do lists. So they had all their individual work stacked together on a big board. So that's where I met these teams and where I joined them on their journey. And another thing that was happening in this organization was the departments were specialized by their professional discipline. So you can probably make out the word electrical in that picture there. So this is a team of electrical engineers. There would be mechanical engineers, process engineers, and neither the twain would mix. So if you imagine an organization which has really separated itself by professional discipline, but this was for a good reason. Most of these people in the team, I can quite gladly say, were far smarter than me. So I was quite honestly the dumbest person in the room most of the time. They'd spent several years studying, a lot of PhDs in the group. So incredibly smart, incredibly analytic. But one of the frustrations was the work that they were doing just wasn't getting delivered. So they would do the engineering calculations, all the work that needed to be done before you could actually put this stuff into action. And a lot of the work they didn't see the light of day. And worse still, if anything involved more than one discipline, you can probably already guess what's going to happen here. It was incredibly hard to get anything that needed multiple disciplines to be delivered. So it would take an inordinate amount of effort and quite a lot of heroics. So the organization wanted to help itself out of this situation because it was tasked with two things. One, maintaining and keeping things running, and the other one was introducing change. Now, the maintaining and keeping things running, they were doing a fairly good job, but they were running to keep themselves where they were. Putting change in, on the other hand, was really suffering. So they were really struggling to sort of advance things. And the problem was some of these changes were actually going to improve their situation, reduce their maintenance. So they needed to get through this, otherwise it was just going to get worse. So based on what I've told you so far, and the little story you know so far, what would be your predictions around the kind of things out of the 6 things on the screen there that would be slowing this team down? So in your Menti, if you want to just vote, out of those 6 headings, what do you believe might be slowing these teams down? So we've definitely got some handoffs and dependencies, starting to take an early lead there, along with starting off too much work, prioritization, unrealistic expectations, a little bit around lack of skills, but very much on the right-hand side and the middle of the chart. So what I will say is you're definitely in the right place. The lack of skills, I'm pausing because there were some areas where they were struggling to get people, largely because of the shortage of skilled physical engineers in this country. It's very hard to get them. There's not enough of them coming out of university. So that was an area. It wasn't necessarily slowing them down, but the other things you're calling out definitely were playing a part in that. So if we get back to this story, so I started with this group. If you imagine, it's a division of about 150, just shy of 150 people, across 6 disciplines, 6 teams. And what I did was I started with the leaders in the area, and I just asked them 2 questions that are on the screen there. I wanted to know, are there any like rays of light? Are there any things they're doing today that are great that they could actually build upon and improve? And then I wanted to understand where they were today in terms of how autonomous they felt to make changes. So I ask these questions quite a lot when I'm working with organizations, because I want to start with a positive outlook rather than a negative outlook of it's all too hard, we can't change. So the first question is to work out, well, what can we actually work on that we're already doing? And the second one is really to get a sense of, do they feel like they're helpless, or do they feel like they can help themselves? And the answers to these questions are very telling. And there was a lot of, on the second question, a lot of suggestions that they felt that they were powerless to make these changes. They didn't have that autonomy, which was interesting insight to start with. But this thing I highlighted on the screen here kept coming up, and I had to ask them what it meant. So there was lots of references to stopping things called P1s and P4s and P3s. And I didn't know what these were. So I had to ask the group what they meant. And they said, well, in a nutshell, imagine you've done a load of work, a load of analysis, you've done a load of engineering calcs, and you've had to take on board other engineering calcs that are going on at the same time, because all these things are going to have to be done together by physical sort of mechanics at the end of the day. But if suddenly your piece of work, your piece of engineering is no longer needed, you have to get permission to take it out of the entire, let's call it a release. But in their world, it's like a deployment of all this engineering and execution. So you had to get permission to take it out. And to get permission, you had to do the reverse calculations. So now you've been asked to do this incredibly taxing engineering calculation to get it ready. And now, with limited time, you've got to do the reverse calculation to say, is it safe to take it out of the execution and still allow the rest of the execution to take place? So this was really disheartening, because these people are having to do double the work and there's absolutely no benefit as a result of it. And they've got hundreds, if not thousands of these P-forms flying about all over the place, really slowing them down. Whilst they're doing more work, they're getting asked to do P-forms for work they've done previously. So they're having to, if you imagine in a code world, in development, you're having to sort of open the code base up, re-understand it, reanalyze it, get back to where you were to be able to do this work to undo it. So these P-forms were really painful, really caused them some distress, and they had a hunch that this was at the root of their problems. So what I wanted to do next with them was really understand, well, why are you doing this? So what's the big so what? And the big deal was they had a huge focus on reliability. It was a maintenance department, and when I joined them, it was less than 90% reliable, their maintenance, their products that were sitting out in the sea. They were doing what's called tripping, and when they trip, they shut down completely. That's vastly expensive, one, to bring them back online, and secondly, they're losing revenue while they're doing it. So there was a real key focus on, how do you start to stop the things that are already causing trips? How do you fix all the stuff you know about that's under the surface? So let's think about like technical debt, that kind of stuff. But in their world, it's more physical engineering debt. And then how do you focus on the future problems rather than backward looking, all the stuff that's tripped today? And that was where their path was, to get to this 94% reliability, which in like uptime for websites and data centers is not particularly good. In this field, it's vast. This was a huge jump if they could make it. So this was one of the measures that they were using as a lagging measure, but a measure of success as what they're doing. And now, equipped with that knowledge and what the leadership felt was going well, what they were empowered to do, and also what their big goal was, their big why was, I started working with each of the teams. So with each of these 6 different engineering specialisms, we did some just general mapping. I don't even have a name for this kind of mapping. It broadly sits alongside static, if people are familiar with that way of bringing Kanban into an organization. But we pretty much just allowed them to draw things and start to describe things. So we were starting to look at the flow of work coming in. So in this picture, the yellow sticky notes indicate where the request is coming from. The peach colored ones are the type of request. And then the stuff to the right is starting to talk about arrival patterns and how execution would happen. But the thickness of the line on these diagrams starts to tell a story about where their big demands are coming from, where the dominant demands are coming from. And it was the first time they'd been able to see, in this wiry complexity, but be able to see where's the big influences coming from. And as you can see highlighted down on here in red again, we've got our little friend, the P form, circled there. So that was coming through, but it wasn't actually as dominant as some of the others. So there was some more dominant ones in there, but it wasn't insignificant. So each of the areas started to map this data out so they could look at the demand coming through, look at the scale of what they're being asked to do, and to try and spot, are there any opportunities already before we get started at a team level? And what this allowed us to do was start to look at then how they were equipped to work, one, on the engineering, and then finally get the stuff done, get it engineered, get it out there and executed. So the 6 specialisms are down the left-hand side of this picture. So we've got our electrical engineers, our process ones, our instrument engineers, integrity, mechanical, RE, which stands for things that spin. And there was a big difference between these groups in that there was two major groupings in there. There was one group in the blue in this picture. They had an interface between them and the execution of the engineering. Now, under normal circumstances, I would see that as a handoff. That's probably not a good thing. But I withheld that judgment and that assumption. And then the one below were teams that were directly exposed to the execution of the engineering. And what was starting to emerge was when the teams were directly exposed to the execution of engineering, they had very, very high volumes of ad hoc requests coming through. So lots and lots of distraction and disturbances in their work. And the big reveal that came out of this work was this idea that they only had enough engineering capacity to do 20% of the engineering calculations that they'd produced. So they're producing all these engineering calculations and only 20% of them are going to make it. When I asked about this and probed into it, the view was, well, we know some of it isn't going to go ahead. Some of it's going to get reversed by a P form. So we're hedging. We're going to just push as much as we can at this funnel and go for it. But as you can see, if only 20% are getting done, now we've got a huge amount of recycle requests. The basis of the work they're doing is engineered based on a certain point in time. So the moment it cycles back, it's gone, it's perished, and it has to be recalculated again. So vast amounts of waste going on there, and lots again of disheartened and really dissatisfied engineers who are doing all this work, and a lot of it they instinctively know isn't going to make it. So I don't know if anyone's ever come across a chap called Frederick Brooks. He passed away recently, sadly, but he produced this book called The Mythical Man Month. If you've never read it before, it's a really, really intriguing read, because he starts to demonstrate why throwing more people or more just more bodies at something will actually slow it down over time. So he shows mathematically why that happens and what that causes. He's not talking about skills, because sometimes you've got skill shortages and adding those skills can have a big impact, but he's talking about just physically throwing as many people at something in the hope that if you do that, it's going to speed things up. I'm speaking to a lot of people at the Kanban Coaching Exchange. You probably already got this sort of concept, but it's really good to read his work, because you can understand a bit more about that picture below, where you've got this idea of a bottleneck, and where you see the bottleneck and where you experience the bottleneck is different. So if you do the analysis and you find out where the bottleneck really is, often you've been adding the capacity in the wrong place. And quite often I find the capacity is getting added, as it was in this story, before the bottleneck. So it was actually creating so much engineering work, there was no chance they were going to deliver it all. So that's where we were at the moment. I'm just going to pause at that point, just see if there's any questions. I'm not seeing any on the screen in Menti, because you can ask them there. But if you've got any questions, feel free to just shout out and say them. I'll move on. Okay, so taking all this together then, so we've now got pictures of what the teams are doing. We understand what the leaders value. We understand how this stuff relates. We started to then put it together. So we took those very wiry diagrams and I used a technique called causal loop mapping. If you've not come across causal loop mapping before, a very simple example on the left-hand side there. So imagine for a minute you own some chickens and they lay you eggs. So as the chickens lay eggs, the eggs hatch into more chickens. So the circle on the left-hand side has got two plus signs, because as the number of chickens increase, the number of eggs increase. As the number of eggs increase, the number of chickens increase. So that's what we call a reinforcing loop, an R loop. It reinforces itself, and they can work both ways. They can reduce the number, the quantity, the stock as it's called, and they can increase the stock. So in this case, the chicken's increasing because the number of eggs laying is increasing. And then on the right-hand side, we have what's called a balancing loop. Now, balancing loops are all over us, all around us in the world. They sort of keep things in check almost. In this example, imagine our chickens start to get quite curious and there's a road nearby and they're going to wander across the road to have a look at what's the other side. And as you can imagine, some of those poor chickens just don't make it there or don't make it back. So there's a minus combining with the plus there to say that the number of chickens returning from their road expedition is not the same as the ones that left. So we've now got the situation where as chickens cross the road, we've got we've got a reducing number coming through. So that in turn is reducing the number of eggs produced. So causal loops allow you to explore more complex relationships that are not linear in nature. And often a lot of what we encounter in corporations and organizations today is quite linear causality thinking, where we think about, well, how do things work? So this must be creating this, must be creating that. Causal loops allow you to look at them in a completely different way. So on the right-hand side is like I call it a summarized view of a causal loop diagram of this team, this division I was working with. And there were 4 big sort of areas or themes coming out of this. One was prioritization. One was interruptions. Another was deliveries and dependencies. And the final one was the ability to execute the work. And inside here were a bunch of different loops, a bunch of reinforcing loops, a bunch of balancing loops, and so on and so forth. And by getting the entire area to do some work on this and understand the nature of how the work comes through, they were starting to have moments of like insight, moments of light bulb moments almost, to say, well, we could try this, or we could do this, you know. And by putting it on a page like this for them, they were able to see their reality and their lived experience in a quite neat summarized version. Not necessarily perfect, absolutely correct. There's probably some mistakes in there, but there was enough in there to generate that kind of thinking of, oh, we can improve this. So the sort of 3 things they were calling out was everything was being pushed. So the reason they were doing so much engineering, because there was a big push from the demand side, do this, do this, do this. There was no differentiation between the requests. So everything pretty much was getting treated as important. So they were thrashing between requests, and that was causing even more problems. And then, as we talked about before, there were frequent interrupts. One example is these P forms. So these requirement to do the engineering to remove your engineering, and other interruptions alongside that. So with that in mind, we started to talk about, well, if you go back to the original picture of their boards, and there was a lot of focus on what everyone doing. So there was a big focus on, is everyone occupied? Is everyone busy? As you've seen so far, of course they were. They were over-consumed. They were overburdened with work. So we started to try and talk about this metaphor of, well, how many battens have you got going at the moment? So if you think of a relay race, are you just running with one baton at the moment? Or are there several battens on the track? Are you trying to all pass battens at the same time? And I was trying to get them to think about, well, how will you reduce and cleanse the number of battens in play at a time? So how can you focus on getting the baton to the end of the track? Because last thing we want is multiple battens, or worse still, battens being dropped on the floor and they're sitting there on the track. In a race, we don't want the team to get to the end. In a relay race, we want the baton to get to the end. That's the goal. And this really started to connect with them, that if they started to focus on the work moving rather than just being busy and taking more requests in, they started to see more opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. Based on what you've heard and what you understand of this story so far, we're going to go into the lab now. And I want you to, using Menti, just share what would be your first experiment you might try if you were in one of those teams. So when you're ready, just type it in Menti. What would be your experience or your experiment based on that experience to help this team out? Got a limiting whip. Glad to see that in a Kanban coaching exchange session. What else could they try? So moving to poll, we mentioned about work being pushed in, value stream optimization, tracking the number of these interruptions per week, yeah. Creating policies, identifying blockers, limiting our goals. That's interesting. Triage tables. Is that, I'm going to have to ask the question, FFOS. Does someone care to share what FFOS is? If not, that's fine. So we've got work item aging, capturing some metrics, pushing the engineering decisions upstream. It's a really useful, interesting one to think about. That might come out in a minute. Triage tables, and then we've got defining service level expectations. So yes, all of these kind of things are great experiments, probably described in a way that these teams wouldn't have known that kind of concept yet, but would have been really interesting to them. I'm just going to pause now and just see if there's any questions before I move on to the next slide, and feel free to shout out, or Vlad, if there's any in the chat, if you want to voice them over, happy to take them. I've got one on screen here now, actually.
And we got an answer, like FFOS is favor finishing over starting. That's from the Zoom chat.
Wonderful. Favor finishing over starting. I like that. So how did team manage the upstream WIP that's usually an annual promise and usually publicly made on, once again, a 5-year plan? Convincing the leadership how? Oh, interesting question. Yes. So they had, I don't know if it was, well, it was multi-year. I'm not sure if it was 5, but it was multi-year. If your existence is 5 years. What I'll do, I'll share a little bit more on the story. You might get this answer. If not, I'll come back and I'll check in with you at the end to make sure we've got that answered. So that's our questions so far. I'll hold that.
I have one, actually.
Yeah.
So it seems quite obvious that these P forms are a problem. So I was kind of like wondering, had they kind of raised them before, and like why were they kept for so long until up to this point if there was such dissatisfaction with them? Were there any kind of like supporters that said like, oh no, we absolutely need to keep them in?
There was quite a general apathy when I joined the team. The 20%, we had to calculate that. We had to do a load of analysis to actually work out that 20% bottleneck in there. And they'd never realized it was quite that tight. When we showed them how we calculated it, there was like a dawning revelation that they're all very smart and they could have done this themselves. But I think in terms of where they were, there was more of they had a very good culture of getting things done when times were tough. So I'll give you an example. The lead in this area was incredibly busy. And really sort of praised or sort of admired the way that he could be very, very kind of steady in a moment, and he could get people together in a room and he could get things done. So they had a culture of, when it was needed, they could really get one thing done. They could get it sorted. So those things I talked about earlier, where they were multidisciplinary, they'd often pretty much stop the line and get a few people in, and they get that multidisciplinary thing done and over the line. What I found with this leader in the area, who was rightfully a little bit cynical about the things I was suggesting, and a little bit skeptical that they'd work. So when I started talking to him at first, he was of the opinion he'd seen things like this before, couldn't see how it would work here. But as we gradually work through this and we get into the metrics a bit later on, he really changed from a detractor to not just an advocate, but a massive advocate. And I was explaining this to Vlad earlier. He was openly bragging in front of his peers about how he had time to think about things, and he could really sort of consider stuff and think about the future. And that became a really big deal, because once he started role modeling, having the capacity to think about things was a good thing. It almost became slightly contagious. So others in the room wanted to also be in that position, because they saw one of their peers had been sort of brave enough to say that openly, which conventional wisdom says you've got to be really busy, you've got to be 100% busy. He was sharing something that was so different to that. But because he had the courage to do that, I think that then gave the team more courage when we got into experimentation to start experimenting, because they're like, well, he's willing to sort of be vulnerable in front of his peers, so I'm willing to try this out. It might not work, but we'll learn from it. So in answer to your question, Vlad, I think where they started, they were nowhere near being in a position where they were willing to sort of try this stuff, as they had that environment around them build, and this leader in particular, role modeling those kind of behaviors, that really got them curious about trying things within their own team, within their own area, and they got far more autonomous as a result of it. I can see a raised hand from Christina.
Yeah, hi there.
Hi
Just a
there.
quick question. So I know that you said the leader was role modeling the behavior, but who was actually the sponsor responsible for, kind of engaging your team? Because you said the leader was a bit skeptical in the beginning.
Yes. Yeah, so they had a transformation area. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is open to debate, but the transformation area would sponsor various initiatives. So they decided this was a big area where there was a huge opportunity to improve by applying some of these kind of ways of thinking and working. They'd had one go already and it hadn't worked out that well. So one of the reasons this individual was quite cynical was because this transformation group had already been in there and it had not really gone that well. So we were starting from a little bit of we were starting quite a few steps back. Yeah. In terms of sponsorship, it moved then from this transformation area. Once the benefits of this started coming through, it shifted to the sort of regional lead, who was this leader's boss, and they sponsored it. So the sponsorship actually shifted over time. It started as a sort of outside in, then it became embraced inside. So I would say,
yeah,
I'm familiar with that pattern, but.
Yeah, the only reason why I asked is because in terms of when you speak about apathy, because I've seen that in certain cultures, and if people are in that system, it's hard for anything to get changed because they're so used to, we fight fires and we put our heads down when we need to work 12-hour days or whatever. So I just wanted to figure out what brought, the kind of transformation in that kind of context. And it's usually not the people fighting fires. So that's why I was asking.
Yeah, it was kind of strange. There's a couple of examples actually. If you've ever heard of a chap called Michael Hammond, I did some work with Michael Hammond a long time ago, and he taught me this concept of team of schemers. Sounds really kind of clandestine, but he said if you get a group of people who are willing to sort of work with you, and they're actually part of the area, he said you're going to achieve much more than trying to do this on your own. So there was a group, my little team of schemers, who we worked together with, and they really rallied around this. So they were the early kind of adopters, the early sort of pioneers of this. And one of them, I remember having a chat with her, and she said to me, like one-to-one, she said, it sounds really silly, but she goes, the whole thing of just pulling something into a done column, there's something about it, a quality about it I can't describe. It's for once I feel like I'm actually I'm doing something. I'm feeling a sense of satisfaction of I've done this work and it's going to get executed, it's going to be done offshore. So it was little things like that, and then their storytelling that started to change the pattern. And there were still people who were a little bit, I'm not really on board with this. But I know one person who was particularly not on board with this. They moved out of the area. They went and worked in another team. And then they contacted me because they said, I want to do what we were doing at that old area because it was so much easier when we could see everything and we could understand what we were doing. So I think it was partly about allowing people enough time to experience this, to make their own judgments and their own sort of considerations, and then decide, am I for this or not? And with this group, it just grew and grew and grew. And we're talking, this was initially it was 3 months before things actually started tipping. And then probably 6 months before they really started working in this way. So it wasn't just sudden. It did take months to actually get to this stage. I don't want to sort of give you any illusion this was a quick thing. It was multi-month. Does that help, Christina? Brilliant. Thank you. So where did they get to? So if you're presumably familiar with the cumulative flow diagram, so a lot of the teams, you remember there was two groups. There were the blue teams who worked with a sort of an interface to the execution. They started to achieve like balance on their CFDs quite quickly. So they started to get this kind of one in for one out delivery coming through, this pattern where they weren't taking loads of work on and not dispatching at the same rate. So their CFD started to show nice kind of balance, these kind of parallel tram lines and not the horrible crocodile jaws. The other three teams took a lot longer, and we'll get into why in a moment. But I think above all, what they were finding was with this data, I told you before, they were highly educated engineering analytical types. This was just so easy for them to pick up. The metrics in the Kanban method was just their home ground. So they could teach me things about this stuff as we were going through it. But they really appreciated the fact they could actually analyze their work as it was flowing through the system and see that aspect of it and use the skills they already had in flow dynamics and things like that and apply really complex scenarios to some of this stuff and push this stuff way beyond what you typically do with any kind of team practicing the Kanban method. And then I did mention multiple levels. So this sort of ties into that switch of sponsorship. So we were working really at flight level 1. If you come across flight levels, Klaus Leopold's sort of concept of having multiple boards that are operating at different levels of granularity. He uses this idea of when you're on the ground on the plane, you can see everything. When you're right at the top, flight level 3, you're up 10,000 feet and everything's very small. You can tell you're over land or over sea. You can tell there's a city there, but you can't see the detail. Well, this organization, they were getting the teams operating well, and then the multidisciplinary work was operating at Kanban flight level 2, so it required more than one discipline. They were starting to see that flowing through as well and making sure they could make trade-offs between operational level disciplines and cross-discipline value chain work at the top. And then they started to bring in what were called their maintenance contracts. So they had contracts with the organization where they committed to do things. Now, in the past, there was a big gulf between the execution of the work going on and these maintenance contracts. Now, when we started to link things up using flight levels, so trying to bring this altitude view in, they suddenly could see why their maintenance contracts were being missed and ways of controlling the traffic to allow stuff to go through and improve their chances of getting these maintenance contracts dispatched in the right order to get them done in a timely fashion. So this was the point when they set this up, that sponsorship took a huge shift. Suddenly the regional manager was just fascinated by this and could see huge potentials, not just in his region, but in other regions. And it sort of started to expand from there. So we have this situation now where we've got all levels of the organization, whether it's the actual execution of the engineering itself, whether it's these multidisciplinary changes, whether it's the big strategic kind of initiatives, their contracts. Everyone could see what was going on for the first time and see how it related together. And by now we'd gone into lockdown as well. So they were using a digital tool, and we had all this stuff fired up inside a digital tool, and it was all flowing through really, really well. So they could actually see blockages being pinged up and down the line straight away. So they were really rallying around problems when they occurred straight away. So what did they discover from all this data? So they did all this work. You remember I mentioned these P-forms? This was like this golden thread going through the middle. They did find that P-forms were quite a big disturbance. It was 20% of their volume of requests coming through were P-forms. But they also discovered that maintenance support was a huge pull on their time. And these were the 3 teams I mentioned who had no disconnection between them and the execution teams. And this maintenance support was these reverse questions coming back in the moment. And what they were able to do then was start to break down that number and really get into, well, what's going on there and what can we do to improve that situation? Because if we don't, between that and the P-forms, we've currently got 50% of our capacity is just gone. And that's not really the stuff we're being asked to do. So those became the 2 targets they were trying to reduce in terms of volume at the benefit of things like Big Rocks, which is this 10% up here, which are these multidisciplinary exercises. And in terms of data, this is again real data from their teams. So in the scatter plots on the left-hand side. We've got the 6 areas there and their relative sort of cycle times that were coming through. What you'll notice, there's 2 types of patterns there. 3 of the teams have got these quite obvious, you can see kind of triangles flowing up of dots. The 2 on the far right and the 1 on the far left bottom corner. They were those 3 teams that had this kind of disturbance patterns coming in. They took a lot longer to tame their basically distributions of their control charts, whereas the other 3 teams, they started to tame their work very quickly. They also started to bring their lead time down and their cycle time overall very quickly as well. So the benefit of that was they were very good at starting to make commitments around when the work would get done and when things were going to be completed. And going back to your experiments earlier, I know someone mentioned something around focus on finishing, not starting. Well, the teams were doing precisely that. They were focusing on finishing and not starting. And the other thing they were doing was they were using the expression, not now, not right now. So they weren't saying no to things. They were starting to get much more comfortable with saying, we can do it, but not right now. And it took some very strong individuals who I really admired for doing this to, again, start to build that kind of culture of, we're not saying no, but we're saying not right now. And then they also asked, if they were given a date, what's the consequence? So if we don't do it, what happens? And just those 2 kind of interactions at the front end where things were getting requested suddenly stemmed the flow of work coming in and got that under control. The focusing on finishing, as someone mentioned in the experiments, that really got the flow out the other end. And lo and behold, suddenly their graphs and their charts were starting to sing. These things are improving. And again, as I said, they were very data fluent, very good at reading charts like this. So they drew a lot out of this, and they could see immediately that their time was improving as a result of it. So, I mean, that was all I was going to cover off today, was really just give you a little bit of a context of an example of working in a non-software context. This particular team, as I said, they had some big light bulb moments. One was this bragging about being slack, having some spare time on your hands. The other one was just this very simple idea of being able to get that sense of satisfaction of something getting done, and also to stop disruption, to stop the things that are getting them to undo the work that they were doing. And what they discovered out of this was, we talked about 20%, that was actually the number of people who could be in the middle of the ocean working on this stuff. There was a physical hard whip limit. And what they did on their boards in the end was they brought this physical hard whip limit in. So they no longer put more work in than they could deliver. And furthermore, they started to show on their boards, visualize on their boards when the execution had been completed. So they actually had the digital tools out where the work was being done, and they could see real time when the work was getting done. So they were getting these real time signals of, I can pull some more work. So pull really started to flow actually when they started to have digital connectivity, because they were across 2 sites, but one was in a very, very like hazardous environment. And actually the idea of having lots of paper there could have got blown around. So I wouldn't normally say go to digital tools, but in this environment, it was a blessing for them. 1, because they were very analytical, and 2, because the environment didn't really lend itself to lots of paper that could blow around. So as I say, that was all I was going to cover off today. Always happy to sort of connect with people. I'm just going to leave my details up on the screen there. So feel free, if you connect to me on LinkedIn, that's probably my primary area. I contact people and speak to them. If you just want to talk about this or other non-software examples, I've worked with HR teams and finance teams. Happy to chat about that. I'm also on Twitter, and my email address is down there. But other than that, I was going to just leave it there and just open for questions, Vlad, if that's okay.
Sounds very good to me. So feel free to put them in the chat if you don't want to be on the video, or if not, just unmute yourself and ask your question.
And while you're thinking about it, I'm just going to put these ones up on screen. I did want to check with the person who asked, how did the team manage upstream WIP? That's usually an annual promise. Did I manage to answer your question, or is there something still unfinished about that? either shout it out on the call or as Vlad said, just put it in the chat and he can let me know.
I think we've waited the customary 3 seconds. There is another one.
Okay. Quite a lot of this could apply to software. What were some of the things that made this environment different? Good question. One of the things was I didn't realize that if you're going to make something out of titanium, you have to put your order in 18 months before you receive it. So there's an 18-month delivery on titanium designed things. I'm not an engineer, as you can tell. So things like that, I liken to huge release cycles. Those were the most extreme. So the big thing was not necessarily the engineering calculations, but what was going to happen after the engineering calculation, and almost trying to balance up the rate at which engineering calculations could be done and these big kind of, I suppose you call them prefabrication delays. Things like titanium was the big one that stood out for me. So that was the big difference. That was a release cycle I couldn't see a way of removing. Maybe someone who works in the hardware field might tell me there is an opportunity, but I was thinking, I don't know how you get to continuous delivery with that, because presumably the people who make things out of titanium have tried everything to improve their processes, but there is a physical limitation there. So that was the big thing that made it different for me anyway. Any other questions?
I have a question. So this is Brianna. When did this project take place?
So it started in December 2019. I had 4 months with them in person, and then lockdown started and we carried the rest out remotely. So we had a switch to remote as well. So it was sort of right on the pandemic, basically.
Okay, so is it still ongoing, basically? This is a team that's still successfully
yes,
operating in this method.
Yeah, they are ironically through LinkedIn. They're still in touch with me, and occasionally do get the odd question from that little group I mentioned, that little team. They still reach out. I do triannually connect with them as well to say, how are you? Really hope it's going well. But my understanding, it is still running. They have run some more experiments, so they've iterated it on from where this story left off. So this is slightly old now, and they've moved on. But yes, they're still operating this way.
Okay, so you answered the question I hadn't had a chance to state, but they're still succeeding, which is a good thing, because I was just curious. I've seen lots of great projects like this, and then all of a sudden you move it under another VP and it crashes and burns. All your good work goes to loss, but it doesn't sound like that's happening. That's good. I was just kind of curious, and you may not be able to answer this then. Are they advocating, their Kanban methodology or their Agile practices to other teams as well? Just kind of curious if they became like Agile advocates all of a sudden.
The person who was sort of advocating, they had time to think about stuff. They were advocating this hard, right down to the tool. And I was sort of saying, no, that's not a good pattern. You can't impose this stuff. You want to open the opportunity. So why don't you invite people to come and see what you're doing, spend some time with you, let them see it and experience it. What I would say was, while I was there, the organization as a whole decided to flip to cross-functional teams. So not just this area, the entire organization, they went everything. I thought this group would go nuts. I thought they would go absolutely berserk about this. What they did, and I couldn't have sort of predicted this, was they flipped so quickly. It was unbelievable, because they had all of their work on boards, if you imagine, by discipline. And they got into a habit of color coding the stuff for the disciplines that they worked in. And then they colored things gray if anyone could do it. It's a very simple thing, but they were saying, well, these work item types require skills. These gray ones, anyone could do it. So it meant that if anyone had some spare capacity, they could pick up the gray stuff and make some space for someone else. When they flipped to these cross-functional teams, suddenly they just interlaced all their boards together. They basically rewired it all together, the filters, and it was like a rainbow. It was wonderful. So now you could see this rainbow color of, because as I said, it takes several years to train. So they couldn't immediately just homegrown more of that specialization in that team, they only had one electrical engineer, let's say. So the electrical engineer, they knew that they were taking all the blue stuff, let's say, for argument's sake. But if that engineer had any gray stuff, the others would take the gray stuff off their hands. So they could. So the same practices that they cultivated worked in a multidisciplinary way. And as you can guess, those cross-disciplinary pieces of work started to speed up across the board. So the second Kanban flight level actually accelerated when they went that way. So not only did they flip quickly, and much to the delight of the organization, because they were then obviously advocating the new way, but they were also getting their cross-functional stuff across even further now because they collaborated that way more often. So I would say that was one example of where it could have faltered and it actually was a benefit for them, allowed them to navigate. And that, yes, as I say, they've done some more experiments since, and they're still running this, but they've gone way beyond where I left them off. So they can teach others now where required. Did that answer your question, by the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Is that my eyesight's not great with this monitor? Is that Maru?
Exactly.
Hi, Maru.
Hey, I stayed hung up on two things you said about the team, about the fact that these are all engineers, or at least analytical types. First question about this is, you said once they got what those various plots, like the scatter charts and the community flow diagrams, were meaning to them. They made it their own, and they started teaching you stuff. I'm super interested in what kind of analysis, or even plotting visualizations, or uses they found to the the usual Kanban data points that we collect.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, so one of the things they did, and I've seen this before because I mentioned I've worked with finance teams, so I've worked with actuaries before. I recommend working with actuaries. They are amazing because they use stochastic forecasting. So this is if you have a pension, what actuaries do, they work out a number of different outcomes and they can forecast where your pension's likely to go based on so many variables and however many years you've got left until you're going to draw upon your pension. They were doing the same here. They had the ability to do stochastic forecasting, so they could actually do quite clever forecasting based on the data trend they had now, and they were getting pretty close to what actually played out. So they were able to then model what was likely to happen to this stuff coming through the system, not just on the traditional kind of way we'd read the charts and we'd use the charts to sort of find out the standard deviations. They were going a step beyond that. So stochastic forecasting, which I'd come across before, I can't confess I'm particularly good at that because I only know the crude amounts of it, but they were very good at then doing some quite detailed sort of forecast sweeps and running a bunch of different runs very quickly. And then they could almost set an expectation to the requester, which pretty much landed right on the nose. Now, I would never recommend using stochastic forecasting to say this is when it's going to be delivered, but they were so close. It was unbelievable. It was great. So that was the one that stuck out for me, was the same thing that the actuaries use, is stochastic forecasting.
Awesome. That means that they were able to run simulations. So they had a probabilistic model. That means they identified a set of variables that they knew were meaningful enough for their simulations. Did you catch any of those particular features other than the classic ones we are using, work item age, WIP, and size, complexity, etc.? They identify any particular ones?
No, I couldn't sort of call them up. I'd have to probably go back and have a chat with them and sort of ask them.
I would have loved to be there with that team. And the other one I had was with using flight levels. You said that the management found it very useful because it could get them perspective. They could trace back what was going on. Did the teams themselves? You touched a little bit on that in your answer to Brianna, but I just would like to ask the question. Did the teams themselves find a particular use and added value from using flight levels, other than coordination, of course? But
I think so. Good example would be, there was a graduate. They had lots of graduates who had gone rotation around teams, and this graduate, before we started doing this, had been in one of the teams, and then they'd left and gone and worked on something else outside. Then they'd come back in. When they came back, they said to me, first time I came and joined the team, I couldn't understand how we got work done. This time round, when I've joined the team, I can see immediately, looking at the board, how work gets done here. So it's apparent how we get work done. And she said, I also can see directly now what I'm contributing towards. So she was looking up the flight levels to work out what this was in service of. And they were using, I'm not plugging this, by the way, they were using Kanban. And I don't know if you've seen in Kanban, you can click on an item and it wiggles the other things that it's linked to. So they could get a quick visualization of all the things that they were contributing towards. So for this individual, it really opened their eyes to how the organization works at a macro level. And it also allowed them, as I said, to understand how work gets done in their particular their team they were in at the time. So they were that was a flight level example, actually, and a non-flight level example. But that was a new benefit for them, was this being able to see, what am I contributing towards, and understanding why we do these things.
Thank you. I don't want to take the rest of the time, but I would have had many follow-up questions. But,
no problem. Well, I mean, I'll leave my details on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to take any more questions after this. But thank you for the questions.